Hello and thanks for joining us for today's video. Just before we start, we want to tell you that we'll be releasing short videos daily. You can watch them here on YouTube, but we'll also be posting them on TikTok and Instagram. Links to both our Instagram account and TikTok account are in the description box. Thank you so much for your time. Without any further delay, here's this week's video. Number 3. John Balaban. John Balaban was born Ioan Balaban in April 1924 in Adab, Kingdom of Romania. Balaban's parents separated when he was young, and his father, a violent alcoholic, later took his own life. Academically inclined, Balaban earned a degree in physics and metallurgy and served short stints in the Romanian army. By October 1947, sensing the Soviet grip tightening, he fled to France seeking refuge. On the night of February 22, 1948, Balaban was in the Paris apartment of 32-year-old Polish chemist Rivaquaz. When she rejected his sexual advances, he strangled her to death. After the murder, Balaban left the country. In the early 1950s, there was mass immigration from Europe to Australia, and many settled in South Australia. The immigrants were called New Australians. Balaban was one of these New Australians. He arrived in Australia in January 1951 on the passenger ship the Hellenic Prince. He settled in Adelaide. Although Balaban was college educated, he couldn't find work in his field, so he worked menial jobs like grape picking, oxy welding, and laboring. Not long after arriving, Balaban met Thelma Joyce Cadd, a divorced cafe proprietor who ran the Sunshine Shack shop, and she lived above it with her 6-year-old son, Philip Cadd. Her mother, Susan Acklin, also stayed with them regularly. Balaban and Thelma married on September 27, 1952. But the marriage rapidly deteriorated. Balaban blamed his mother-in-law for a lot of the marital tension, and by December 1952, just months after getting married, the couple separated. Days later, on December 5, 1952, Balaban strangled 29-year-old Zora Cusick to death in the shack where she lived. Afterward, he mutilated her body. Several people were questioned, and they saw Cusick with Balaban just before she was killed. On December 8, 1952, Balaban was arrested. He went to trial, but the prosecution had no physical evidence, and they didn't think there was a motive, so the judge dismissed the charges. On April 12, 1953, Balaban was intoxicated, and he went back to the apartment he shared with his estranged wife, Thelma Balaban. He beat her in the head with a hammer. He then went to the bedroom of his much-loathed mother-in-law, Susan Acklin. He beat her with the hammer as well. He then beat his stepson, 6-year-old Philip Cadd. 24-year-old Verna Manny, a waitress at the cafe, was also sleeping in the apartment that night. Balaban started to beat her with a hammer as well. She was able to defend herself and jumped out of a window to the ground 20 feet below. She screamed for help and awoke the neighbors. 30-year-old Thelma was dead in bed. 65-year-old Susan and 6-year-old Philip Cadd were taken to the hospital, but they also died from their injuries. Vera Manny was the sole survivor of the attack. At John Balaban's trial in July 1953, his defense team argued that he was not responsible for the murders because he had schizophrenia, which was supported by psychiatric testimony. But the prosecution, backed up by expert witnesses, confirmed Balaban's awareness of his actions and intent. Balaban was found guilty and he was sentenced to death. At 8 a.m. on August 26, 1953, John Balaban became the 42nd individual executed at Adelaide Jail. His was the first execution of a post-war immigrant in South Australia, making deep societal unease over the death penalty and New Australians. He's also considered modern Australia's first serial killer. The prison where he was executed and his remains are buried, Adelaide Jail, is supposedly haunted by his ghost. It closed in 1988 and it is now a museum and tourist attraction. Many people have heard disembodied voices and whispers near his grave. They feel malevolent presence and describe the atmosphere as suffocating. People have also reported being touched, pushed, or feeling an invisible hand grip their shoulder. Shadows flit across hallways where no one stands, and objects like doors and keys sometimes move on their own. More sensitive visitors can even feel overwhelming waves of dread or sorrow. It appears that John Balaban wasn't ready to cross over, and he still wants his presence to be known. Number 2. Peter Kurten. Peter Kurten was born into a low-income family in Cologne, Germany in May 1883. He was the eldest of 13 children. His father was a sadistic and abusive alcoholic. He used to force Kurten to watch him and his mother have sex. When Kurten was 9, he started committing sex acts with animals. He found a lot of gratification from killing the animal during the act. Kurten claimed he committed his first murders when he was 9. He was on a raft on a river with 2 other boys. He pushed one of them, who couldn't swim, into the water. The second boy jumped in to save him. Kurten steered the raft away from the boys, and they drowned. Kurten committed his first confirmed murder on May 25, 1913, when he was 30. He entered the home of 10-year-old Christine Klein in Mulheim and stabbed her to death. Kurten served in World War I while he went AWOL, which led to him being in prison. After he was released, he settled in Dusseldorf, Germany. In Dusseldorf, he fully indulged in his dark desires. On February 9, 1929, he grabbed 9-year-old Rosa Ohlinger, who was walking alone on the street. He sexually assaulted her and stabbed her 13 times with a pair of scissors. 5 days later, he stabbed a 43-year-old mechanic, only identified as Herr Scher, 20 times with a knife. The mechanic died from his wounds. On August 23, 1929, Kurten killed a pair of foster sisters, 5-year-old Gertrude Hamacher and 14-year-old Louise Lenzen. He strangled them and slit Gertrude's throat and decapitated Louise. On September 29th, Kurten raped and beat Ida Reuter to death with a hammer. Kurten struck again less than 2 weeks later. On October 11, 1929, he beat another young woman to death, Elizabeth Dorier. On November 7th, he murdered 6-year-old Gertrude Alberman. After he stabbed her 35 times, he sent the police a letter with a map to the body. People in Dusseldorf were terrified. The killer became known as the Dusseldorf Vampire, and the murders made headlines around the world. Although Kurten was called a vampire, there's no evidence he drank any of his victims' blood. On May 14, 1930, Kurten forced Marie Budlick to go back to his apartment, where he sexually assaulted her. She didn't fight him, so he decided not to kill her. After the assault, Kurten walked Budlick towards the tram station and then walked away. Budlick wrote about the assault in a letter and she mailed it to a friend. However, she had written the incorrect address, so a postal clerk opened the letter to see if they could determine the correct address. She was shocked by what she read, so she handed the letter over to the police. The police tracked down Budlick, who led them to Kurten's apartment. The police immediately suspected that Kurten was the vampire. Kurten was questioned, but he denied having anything to do with the murders. 4 days later, on May 23rd, Kurten turned himself in and confessed to the murders. Besides killing 9 people, he also attacked at least 20 other women. They were raped, beaten, or stabbed, but all survived. Peter Kurten went to trial for the 9 murders and 7 attempted murders in April 1931. He was found guilty and he was sentenced to death. On July 2nd, 1931, he was led to the guillotine in Cologne, Germany. His last words were supposedly, quote, "Tell me, after my head is chopped off, will I be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my neck? That would be the pleasure to end all pleasures," unquote. 48-year-old Peter Kurten was then beheaded. But Peter Kurten's story doesn't end there. Kurten's crimes were so shocking at the time that people thought there had to be something physically wrong with his brain. So his head was cut open and his brain was examined. No abnormalities were found. The brainless head was mummified. Shortly after, the end of World War II was purchased by antiques collector Arnie Coward in the United States. Coward was known for his eccentric collection. He owned and operated a museum of pain and torture in Hawaii. When Coward died, Ripley's Believe It or Not purchased the head. It's on display at their museum in Wisconsin Dells, a city that's a popular tourist destination in central Wisconsin. It's hanging by a hook in a display case that looks like a guillotine. Kurten's ghost supposedly haunts the museum. Near his head, people hear strange voices and see shadow figures on the walls. American Ghost Walks used an EVP and recorded something strange, but it's unclear what it is. Here is a recording. Kurten's ghost is also known to blow the air horns in the bathroom. Many employees will not go near the head alone. At the time of this recording, the head is on display and it's one of the museum's main attractions. Number 1. Ted Bundy. One of America's most notorious serial killers, Theodore Robert Cowell, better known as Ted Bundy, was born on November 24, 1946 in Burlington, Vermont. He was raised to believe that his unwed biological mother was his sister. In 1950, when Bundy was 4, he and his mother moved across the country to Tacoma, Washington. Bundy's mother, Louise, got married to Johnny Culpepper Bundy, who adopted Ted. Bundy was a bright young man, and there weren't many signs in his early childhood that he would go on to kill dozens of women. Some believe Bundy committed his first murder when he was 14. On August 31, 1961, 3-year-old Ann Burr was kidnapped in the middle of the night from her home in Tacoma and was never seen again. The police found evidence that a teenager was possibly responsible for the kidnapping. Bundy lived 2 miles from the family's home and supposedly knew Ann. Ted Bundy's first confirmed murder happened late on the night of January 31st or early on February 1st, 1974. He entered the Seattle, Washington home of 21-year-old Linda Healy. He bashed her in the head with a blunt object and kidnapped her. Her remains were eventually recovered, but it's unclear how she was killed. Bundy kidnapped 19-year-old Donna Mason on March 12, 1974, as she was walking alone on the campus of her university. He most likely sexually assaulted her and then killed her. Bundy struck again 3 weeks later. On April 17, 1974, he kidnapped 18-year-old Susan Rancourt from the campus of Central Washington State College in Ellensburg, Washington. It's believed he lured her to his car by wearing a sling on his arm and feigning problems carrying some books. 22-year-old Kathy Parks was the fourth confirmed victim. He kidnapped her from Oregon State University in Corvallis, Oregon on May 6, 1974. Less than a month later, on June 1, 1974, 22-year-old Brenda Bell went missing while walking to a tavern in Buren, Washington. She was last seen talking to a man in an arm sling. 10 days later, on June 11th, Bundy kidnapped 18-year-old Georgianne Hawkins from an area behind her sorority house near Seattle's University of Washington. On July 14, 1974, Bundy kidnapped Janice Off from Lake Sammamish State Park in Issaquah, Washington. Hours later, he returned to the beach and kidnapped 18-year-old Denise Naslund. Shortly after kidnapping and murdering the two women in a single day, Bundy moved to Salt Lake City, Utah, and continued his murder spree. On October 2, 1974, he kidnapped 16-year-old Nancy Wilcox while she was walking alone in Holiday, a Salt Lake City suburb. 16 days later, he abducted 17-year-old Melissa Smith from Midvale, Utah. He beat her with a crowbar and strangled her with a ligature. She may have been kept alive for up to a week before she was killed. Bundy raped, beat, and strangled to death 17-year-old Laura Amy after kidnapping her from Lehi, Utah on Halloween night, 1974. On November 8, 1974, Bundy attempted to kidnap 18-year-old Carol DeRanche, but she escaped and reported the crime to the police. Undeterred by the failed abduction, hours later, Bundy kidnapped 17-year-old Deborah Kent from the parking lot of a high school in Bountiful, Utah. The police suspected that one man was responsible for all 12 murders. They had a general description of the killer, who was seen talking to the victims or was in the area when the women were last seen. Also, someone had heard him introduce himself to a victim as Ted. The police also believed that Ted drove a Volkswagen Beetle. They thought he lured women to his car and then took them somewhere where he sexually assaulted and murdered them. The police, unfortunately, didn't know they were looking for Ted Bundy. On January 12, 1975, Bundy kidnapped 23-year-old Karen Campbell from a hotel in Aspen, Colorado. She was stabbed multiple times and beaten with a blunt object. A month later, on March 15, 1975, Bundy abducted and murdered 26-year-old Julie Cunningham from Vail, Colorado. Weeks later, on April 6, Bundy murdered 24-year-old Denise Oliverson. He kidnapped her while she was riding her bike in Grand Junction, Colorado. On June 27, 15-year-old Sue Curtis was kidnapped in Provo, Utah by Bundy. On August 16, 1975, Bundy was arrested after trying to escape a police officer who attempted to pull him over as he drove his Volkswagen Beetle. He was released shortly afterward. But days later, an astute detective reading the report about Bundy's arrest connected him to what had been called the Ted murders. Carol DeRanche, who escaped from Bundy, identified him in a physical lineup. People at the high school where Deborah Smith was kidnapped reporting seeing or talking to a man who was behaving oddly outside the high school. They all identified Bundy as well. However, the police didn't find any physical evidence connecting him to the 16 murders. Bundy was tried for the kidnapping of Carol DeRanche, and he was convicted. He was sentenced to 1 to 15 years in prison. Then in October 1976, Bundy was charged with Karen Campbell's murder in Colorado. In April 1977, he was transferred to the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. For his murder trial, Bundy was going to serve as his own defense lawyer. To prepare for the trial, several times a week, he was taken to the law library, which was on the second floor of the Pitkin County Courthouse. On June 7, 1977, Bundy climbed out a second-story window, dropped 25 feet to the ground below, and ran. He was recaptured 6 days later in Aspen. 6 months later, on December 30th, 1977, Bundy escaped from jail. Using a contraband saw blade, he had cut a hole in the roof of his ceiling. He climbed up the ceiling and was able to climb down into the apartment of the head jailer. He changed into his set of clothes and walked away from the jail. Using the money he had saved from visitors, Bundy made his way to Florida. On January 14, 1978, just before 3 a.m., Bundy snuck into Florida State University's Chi Omega sorority house in Tallahassee, Florida. he attacked 4 young women with a piece of wood. He killed 21-year-old Margaret Bowman and 20-year-old Lisa Levy, and the other 2 survived. Attacking the 4 women didn't appease his bloodlust. He entered the basement apartment of a 21-year-old woman who lived a few blocks from the sorority house. He savagely beat her in the head with a piece of wood. She survived, but was permanently injured. Weeks later, on February 9, 1978, Bundy snatched 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, who was walking on her high school campus in Lake City, Florida. Ted Bundy was arrested 6 days later while driving a stolen Volkswagen Beetle. Initially, the police were unaware of his identity. On February 17th, after 2 days in custody, the man confessed to the 3 detectives that he was Ted Bundy. Bundy had been added to the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list 5 days earlier. On July 27, 1978, Ted Bundy was indicted for the attacks at the Chi Omega sorority house. 4 days later, Bundy was charged with the murder of Kimberly Leach. Ted Bundy's trial for the Chi Omega murders happened on June 25, 1979. A woman who saw the killer leaving the sorority house testified that Bundy was the man she saw that night. Hairs found in a mask made from pantyhose were similar to Bundy's hair. After a month-long trial, Bundy was found guilty and sentenced to death. Bundy was also convicted of the murder of Kimberly Leach. Once again, he was given a death sentence. On January 24, 1989, Bundy was brought to the death chamber at 7 a.m. and strapped to the electric chair at Florida State Prison. His last words were, quote, "I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends," unquote. 42-year-old Ted Bundy was pronounced dead at 7:16 a.m. After his execution, many people in the prison said that they saw the ghost of Ted Bundy. Several correctional officers reported seeing the ghost sitting in the electric chair. They said he was smiling, and he looked as if he knew something that they didn't. When they approached the chair, Bundy's ghost disappears. It got to the point where people wouldn't go into the death chamber alone. The warden said that anyone who mentioned Ted Bundy's ghost would be fired. Bundy's ghost also appears in his death row holding cell. He says, quote, "Well, I beat you all, didn't I?" unquote, and then he vanishes. Ted's ghost is a white-blue mist, but it's very detailed. He's most often seen in the early morning, and he's always smiling. Supposedly, Bundy's childhood home in Tacoma, Washington is also haunted. A contractor who did work on the home said that strange things happened while he and his team were there. Initially, things didn't feel right, but they couldn't put their finger on what was wrong. The contractor had an 11-year-old daughter who occasionally came to work sites. She didn't know that it was Bundy's former house, but she was too terrified to enter it. Then bizarre things began to happen in the house. For example, cell phones stopped working, heavy furniture would fall on its own, and cabinet doors would spring open. They saw strange messages such as, "Help me," written in dust. One time it was written on the outside of a window, which was behind a screwed-on screen protector. The contractor had 2 pastors come to the home and bless the house. He also wrote Bible verses on the walls before painting over them. Some of Bundy's victims have also become ghosts. Lily Collins starred in the film Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil and Vile, which is about Ted Bundy. She said while preparing for the film, where she plays Bundy's ex-girlfriend, Elizabeth Culper, she was visited by the ghosts of Bundy's victims. She said that every morning at 3:05, she would suddenly wake up. She felt like she had been involved in a struggle. She said she believed the ghosts of the victims were communicating with her, however, she was not frightened by them. She said she felt as if they were thanking her for telling their story. Thank you so much for watching today's video. If you enjoyed it, we'd really appreciate it if you subscribed. Also, don't forget to watch our shorts on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok. Once again, thank you for watching.